Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great weekend. We are a week plus into October, so I thought I'd do my September Marginalia video, just discussing any short stories, poems, essays, whole books I read across the past month and didn't do any videos about. And then a couple of fun musical selections, two of which do relate to one of the stories I read this past month. This will be a slightly lighter Marginalia. Work has been crazy busy, so I haven't been able to read quite as much as I certainly do during the summer. But there's been a lot, especially the short stories, I think, the past month were excellent. So I'll start by talking about Anniversaries by Uwe Johnson. This is a mammoth of a book. There are two of these volumes. They chronicle a full year in the life of a middle-aged woman living in New York City and her daughter, and Gesine and Marie Cressball. And the woman Gesine is an Anglo-German immigrant to the U.S. And what you don't get from sort of the hype, such that there is around the book, is that a good portion of it is not the daily chronicle of what's happening in the U.S. and in the world. 1967, 1968, certainly very tumultuous years, both for the U.S. and the world, and the Cressballs within the book. But there's a good portion of it that is actually taking place a generation earlier, with Gesine's ancestors in Germany, and then later on in England, in Richmond, and sort of their experiences in the 1920s and 1930s. And so that juxtaposition is actually kind of one of the delights of the book. I've been trying to do the read it across a year challenge, so each day I read the one, chapter entry that there is for that day, that date. And I've been able so far to be able to keep track of the characters and the different moods and things that are happening. But if things get too much crazier at work, what I may do is sit down every Saturday or Sunday or someday during the week and just read all of the entries for that week, to sort of make sure I'm able to focus in on the characterizations. Because as much as we're getting this whole panoramic view of a life and all the minutiae, reading 2 to 7 pages a day over and over and over does make it feel a bit more like reading a daily column from a newspaper, when that was a thing that people did. And one of the features of the book is how much Gesine and her daughter, to a certain extent, rely on the New York Times, and quote from it and reference that being this ritual they have. But let's talk about some stories now. I did finally finish the book of stories edited by Randall Jarrell. And this is fantastic. This is one of the best anthologies I've ever encountered. I kind of want to do a video around great anthologies at some point in the future. This would be on that list. I don't know if it would be at the top, but it would be on the list. So I finished out reading the last handful of stories. Sorrow-Acre from Izak Diniesin, famous for the Out of Africa stories. Sorrow-Acre is about a woman who, to save her son from the punishment for a petty crime that could lead to his death, she will go and harvest, reap an entire acre on her own, and it can't be done. And so that's the story. But it was fantastic. I also read Samson and Delilah by D.H. Lawrence. Wasn't great, not one of his. D.H. Lawrence, I think, is capable of being a very strong short story writer. I should say was. He's no longer alive. And he was capable of being a very strong poet, and he was capable of being a very strong novelist. I have no idea why Randall Jarrell selected Samson and Delilah for this volume. It's a non-example of a good story. And Lawrence had other good stories. I read 5 Anecdotes from Chuang, Fair Eckbert from Ludwig Tieck. And those were both interesting. Fair Eckbert was sort of a weird fairy tale type story. And then the 5 Anecdotes were curious. There were a couple of entries in here, like the Book of Jonah, or an anonymous fairy tale about a king, a red queen, and a witch, that were just outstanding. And so the 5 Anecdotes kind of went along with that, and were a curiosity in terms of how we can view stories and how we view narratives. But this anthology, if you ever find a copy, by all means pick it up. It is one that can be read and reread. I read a single story from In the Heart of the Country by William Gass. I read Order of Insects. And I read that in part because my wife, with her travel nursing assignment, has been down in Tucson, where the flora and fauna are a little different than up here in Phoenix. The desert is more moist in Tucson, it gets more water, and so there are larger animals and larger insects and larger spiders. So I've read Order of Insects. I'll be continuing to read from this volume. From the portable 20th century Russian reader. Great volume. There is a portable Russian reader, and that was published a long time ago, like 70 years ago at this point. And then later on, about 20 years later, they split them into two volumes. There's a 19th century Russian reader and a 20th century Russian reader. Apparently nothing else merited a volume. But this one is a keeper. It's got a lot of great stories in here. I read The Cave by Evgeny Zamyatin, who famously wrote We. The Cave is fantastic. It's a horror story wrapped up as this moral parable about how miserable life is when, the revolution occurs and suddenly there's no food, there's no power, there's no wood for heating. And so this older couple basically view life as being like they're cave people again, and just trying to survive against the elements. So it was quite horrifying and very poignant. And then I read Light Breathing by Ivan Bunin. And I was not familiar with Bunin as a writer, and I think that's the only selection from him in here. But I do have another anthology of Russian short stories. I'll be taking a look at that, see if he's in there, represented in there. From The Decapitated Chicken by Horacio Quiroga, I read The Sun. Not his most powerful story. Certainly The Decapitated Chicken is much more horrifying. The Feather Pillow. There are plenty of super strong Quiroga stories represented in here. The Sun is very good, but Quiroga was, again, capable of masterpieces. The Sun is a very good story by a master writer. Someone else whose short fiction I find much more interesting than his novels, and that would be Stephen King. And so this will lead into the next volume. I've been kind of dabbling in some 70s, 80s horror stories and horror anthologies, and King is periodically represented in those, including the short story Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, which is fantastic. I love that story. I read it first, I want to say in college in this volume, Skeleton Crew, but I had read it again several years later, and then I reread it this past month, and I really enjoy that story. It's about a woman who's trying to find the quickest way from a small town to the sort of city that she lives in Maine, and going through the back ways and the county roads. And that's something that I've always enjoyed and appreciated when I was visiting family in Louisiana or Arkansas, just going different places. So that's something I've really enjoyed. And that story is fantastic. And the horror that ensues, but the hope that ensues within it. And then I read The Monkey, which is more of King's ilk, where there's horror involving like violence to children and stuff like that. But I then want to talk about the Year's Best Horror Stories from Karl Edward Wagner, which is a great horror anthology series that Wagner edited from the 1980s and I believe into the 1990s before he passed away. And it's one of the best selections of horror fiction that you'll find really in any era, but particularly sort of the post pulp magazines of the 1920s and 30s era. It's absolutely fantastic stories. Wagner had a real love for horror, and he would really try to appreciate all of the different facets that horror fiction can occupy, that it's not just, body horror, or it's not just, ghost stories or atmospheric. It's not just cosmic horror, but it can be any of those things and many other types of horror. And so he edited this series, I believe starting with number 8, volume 8. And these can be hard to find, but again, if you're at all a fan of horror fiction and you see any of the ones that Wagner edited, I highly recommend them. His editorial choices were often very, very good. And this particular volume, volume 10, has some real winners. So Through the Walls by Ramsey Campbell. Campbell's a great horror writer. Through the Walls is very, very unsettling. It involves some pretty deep-seated evil feelings and urges that characters have that ultimately turn out not to be harmful, but the sense of the unsettling sense of evil is very present in that story. Touring, which was a collaboration between Gardner Dozois, who periodically popped up more recently as an editorial partner of George R. Martin on a number of good fantasy and science fiction volumes. Gardner Dozois, Jack Dan, and Michael Swanwick did Touring. That's possibly my favorite story. It's not the best horror story in here, but it's possibly my favorite story in here, where Buddy Holly lands in Minnesota from the plane crash, the day the music died. He lands, and he's trying to like check out his hotel, and there are other characters there. He runs across someone who he ultimately realizes is Elvis Presley, except older and heavier. And he runs across a woman who he's never met, who's kind of dressed sort of as a hippie. We recognize her as a hippie, and he can't figure out really who she is. And it turns out that the three of them have been brought there together to play this one big show. And they each have their moments. And then they all gather together to sing Not Fade Away one last time as ghosts. And Not Fade Away was probably not the last song Buddy Holly played, but apocryphally that became pushed, partly because of the poetic sense of that title being his last song, and also because I believe that was what they play in the Buddy Holly story film. But Touring is a great story. Every Time I Say I Love You from Charles L. Grant, which is absolutely horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. The lengths a character will go, the lengths a husband will go, or a spouse will go to recapture the lost loved one who's died. There are lengths that this character is going through. Homecoming from Harold Goldsmith, which is very good. Old Hobby Horse from A.F. Kidd, again very good. Luna by G.W. Perriwills, which Wagner points out in his editorial introduction, really would probably have been classified as science fiction, but is a horror story. It deals with a character who's an astronaut and is having these dreams of feeling like that he has crash landed somewhere and is being chased. And the dreams keep getting more and more vivid and affecting him. So I haven't finished this volume, but I'll probably be finishing in October, and this has been a real winner. Let's see. I read some more poems from Matthew Arnold, a poet my daughters really enjoy. I reread one of my all-time favorite writers, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and I'll link the video I did on her on this book last year. But I reread El Sueño, which is just a marvelous, marvelous piece of writing. And one that this translation from Margaret Sayers Payton, one of my favorite translators from Spanish into English, captures so well. But with that, I then was reading Octavio Paz's essay, Sor Juana, about the writer and sort of what she was encountering. And then I read The Siren and the Seashell, which is his essay on the great Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío, who sort of kicked off modernism in Latin America. And Paz probably underrates Darío, a poet I really enjoy. I also was enjoying some more diverse reading selections. By diverse, I mean just scattered reading selections. So as I was reading Master and Margarita and Kafka on the Shore and works like that, I did find myself going and rereading some of Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit, from the German Idealist Philosophy volume Penguin publishes. And then I finally found a copy of Fathers and Crows by William T. Vollmann, and I started it, and then I realized I wanted to reread The Ice Spirit, so I'm midway through reading that right now. But as part of my warm-up for Fathers and Crows, I was reading from the autobiography of St. Ignatius in my Essential Writings of Christian Mysticism volume, a great, great anthology as well. Other essayists, of course, Virginia Woolf from the famous, justifiably famous Common Reader volume. I read The Modern Essay and The Patron and the Crocus, which was a really interesting exploration of how sort of that history of writers and artists and their patron, and the ways that's changed, and the ways Woolf was exploring how it was even changing in the modern world. That was a really insightful essay. I finished reading the 1940 essays from George Orwell. Those, of course, are totally in the shadow of the beginning of World War II. And Orwell despising Stalin, recognizing all of the dangers, and the horrors that both Stalin and Hitler represent, and then being absolutely bewildered at the lack of response in his own native, United Kingdom. And there are Neville Chamberlain and company coming for plenty of diatribes here, but Orwell is, as always, a very incisive writer. Even where his feelings and sentiments guide his mind, he's an incisive writer. And I'm looking forward to just continuing in this volume. Continuing my my sort of pre-game for Fathers and Crows, I had mentioned I was rereading The Ice Shirt from William T. Vollmann, and so to prep for that, I reread Eric the Red saga and the saga of the Greenlanders in the Great Sagas of Icelanders volume. Those are two of the famous Vinland sagas, or Vineland sagas. With finishing Kafka on the Shore, and its emphasis and terrible appropriation of the Oedipus myth. I did read Robert Graves' thoughts on Oedipus's entry in his Greek myths. And then I finished my year read-through of God, a Biography from Jack Miles. And I was reading each chapter in conjunction with reading those books from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, sort of in the order that Miles had structured the book, in the order of the Hebrew Bible. And I found this book underwhelming. There were some sections of it that I thought were really interesting, interpretations, of course, that I thought were interesting. But I also felt like Miles was making certain choices in terms of omitting things. So, for example, he basically takes the prophets and then he produces, I believe it was 3 of the prophets who write longer and 3 of the prophets who write shorter works. And that was it. And the 3 who write shorter works were all grouped into one chapter together. And so I just felt like there were certain choices Miles made to sort of guide his arguments around this, the approach of exploring God as this literary character, using the Hebrew Bible as the works upon which, this character can be revealed. So it was okay. It was very underwhelming. I was surprised. I had expected more, I think. And then as I was enjoying the section on the Psalms here, I had gone back, and anytime there was a psalm quoted, I would read any of the translations of it that were in my Psalms in English translation. So that was it for the reading. Let me know if you've read any of these. I'm sure there are plenty of great things you have appreciated from these works or similar works that I would love to learn from. But I do want to give some musical recommendations. I had mentioned that in touring, there was Buddy Holly and Elvis. I don't want to spoil who the third character is for anybody who does read that story. So from Buddy Holly, I'm going to link in Not Fade Away. It is my younger daughter's favorite Buddy Holly song. From Elvis, I'm going to link in what might have been the last song he played before he passed, Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. And then I will link in Electric Lady from Janelle Monáe, a wonderful song, much more recent song. But again, I hope everybody's doing well. All the best. Thanks.